It was quite natural, therefore, that among the Marxian neophytes who were caught up in this atmosphere, there should be more than one, quote, author who got a swelled head. We can now speak calmly of this period as of an event of the past. It is no secret that the brief period in which Marxism blossomed on the surface of our literature was called forth by an alliance between people of extreme and of very moderate views. In point of fact, the latter were bourgeois Democrats. This conclusion, so markedly confirmed by their subsequent critical development, suggested itself to some even when the, quote, alliance was still intact. That being the case, are not the revolutionary social democrats who entered into the alliance with the future, quote, critics, mainly responsible for the subsequent, quote, confusion? This question, together with a reply in the affirmative, is sometimes heard from people with too rigid a view, but such people are entirely in the wrong. Only those who are not sure of themselves can fear to enter into temporary alliances even with unreliable people. Not a single political party could exist without such alliances. The combination with the legal Marxists was in its way the first really political alliance entered into by Russian Social Democrats. Thanks to this alliance, an astonishingly rapid victory was obtained over Narodism, and Marxist ideas, even though in a vulgarized form, became very widespread. Moreover, the alliance was not concluded altogether without conditions. Evidence of this is the burning by the censor in 1895 of the Marxist collection Material on the Question of the Economic Development of Russia. If the literary agreement with the legal Marxists can be compared with a political alliance, then that book can be compared with a political treaty. The rupture, of course, did not occur because the, quote, allies proved to be bourgeois Democrats. On the contrary, the representatives of the latter trend are natural and desirable allies of social democracy insofar as its democratic tasks, brought to the fore by the prevailing situation in Russia, are concerned. But an essential condition for such an alliance must be the full opportunity for the socialists to reveal to the working class that its interests are diametrically opposed to the interests of the bourgeoisie. However, the Bernsteinian and critical trend, to which the majority of the legal Marxists turned, deprived the socialists of this opportunity and demoralized the socialist consciousness by vulgarizing Marxism, by advocating the theory of the blunting of social contradictions, by declaring the idea of the social revolution and of the dictatorship of the proletariat to be absurd, by reducing the working class movement and the class struggle to narrow trade unionism, and to a, quote, realistic struggle for petty, gradual reforms. This was synonymous with bourgeois democracy's denial of socialism's right to independence, and, consequently, of its right to existence. In practice, it meant a striving to convert the nascent working class movement into an appendage of the liberals. Naturally, under such circumstances, the rupture was necessary, but the, quote, peculiar feature of Russia manifested itself in the fact that this rupture simply meant the elimination of the Social Democrats from the most accessible and widespread, quote, legal literature. The, quote, ex-Marxists who took up the flag of, quote, criticism and who obtained almost a monopoly to, quote, demolish Marxism, entrenched themselves in this literature. Catchwords like against orthodoxy and long live freedom of criticism, now repeated by Rabotchaya Dielo, forthwith became the vogue, and the fact that neither the censor nor the gendarmes could resist this vogue is apparent from the publication of 3 Russian editions of the work of the celebrated Bernstein, celebrated in the Herostratian sense, and from the fact that the works of Bernstein, Mr. Prokopovich, and others were recommended by Zubetov in Iskra number 10. A task now devolved upon the Social Democrats that was difficult in itself and was made incredibly more difficult by purely external obstacles, the task of combating the new trend. This trend did not confine itself to the sphere of literature. The turn towards criticism was accompanied by an infatuation for economism among social democratic practical workers. The manner in which the connection between and interdependence of legal criticism and illegal economism arose and grew is in itself an interesting subject, one that could serve as the theme of a special article. We need only note here that this connection undoubtedly existed. The notoriety deservedly acquired by the Credo was due precisely to the frankness with which it formulated this connection and blurted out the fundamental political tendency of economism. Let the workers carry on the economic struggle. It would be more correct to say the trade unionist struggle, because the latter also embraces specifically working class politics. And let the Marxist intelligentsia merge with the liberals for the political, quote, struggle. Thus, trade unionist work, quote, among the people, meant fulfilling the first part of this task, while legal criticism meant fulfilling the second. This statement was such an excellent weapon against economism that, had there been no Credo, it would have been worth inventing one. The Credo was not invented, but it was published without the consent and perhaps even against the will of its authors. At all events, the present writer, who took part in dragging this new program into the light of day, has heard complaints and reproaches to the effect that copies of the resume of the speaker's views were distributed, dubbed the Credo, and even published in the press together with the protest. We refer to this episode because it reveals a very peculiar feature of our economism, fear of publicity. This is a feature of economism generally, and not of the authors of the Credo alone. It was revealed by that most outspoken and honest advocate of economism, Rabocea Missile, and by Rabocea Diello, which was indignant over the publication of economist documents in the Vademecum, as well as by the Kiev Committee, which 2 years ago refused to permit the publication of its Profession de foi, together with their repudiation of it, and by many other individual representatives of economism. This fear of criticism displayed by the advocates of freedom of criticism cannot be attributed solely to craftiness, although, on occasion, no doubt craftiness is brought into play. It would be improvident to expose the young and as yet frail shoots of the new trend to attacks by opponents. No, the majority of the economists look with sincere resentment, as by the very nature of economism they must, upon all theoretical controversies, factional disagreements, broad political questions, plans for organizing revolutionaries, etc. Quote, "Leave all that to the people abroad," said a fairly consistent economist to me one day, thereby expressing a very widespread, and again purely trade unionist view. Our concern is the working class movement, the workers' organizations here in our localities, and all the rest is merely the invention of doctrinaires, quote, "the overrating of ideology," as the authors of the letter, published in Istra number 12, expressed it in unison with Rabocea Diello number 10. The question now arises, such being the peculiar features of Russian criticism and Russian Bernsteinism, what should have been the task of those who sought to oppose opportunism in deeds and not merely in words? First, they should have made efforts to resume the theoretical work that had barely begun in the period of legal Marxism, and that fell anew on the shoulders of the comrades working underground. Without such work, the successful growth of the movement was impossible. Secondly, they should have actively combated the legal criticism that was perverting people's minds on a considerable scale. Thirdly, they should have actively opposed confusion and vacillation in the practical movement, exposing and repudiating every conscious or unconscious attempt to degrade our program and our tactics. That Rabocea Diello did none of these things is well known. We shall have occasion below to deal with this well-known fact in detail and from various aspects. At the moment, however, we desire merely to show the glaring contradiction that exists between the demand for, quote, freedom of criticism and the specific features of our native criticism and Russian economism. It suffices but to glance at the text of the resolution in which the Union of Russian Social Democrats Abroad endorsed the point of view of Rabocea Diello. Quote, "In the interests of the further ideological development of social democracy, we recognize the freedom of criticism of social democratic theory in party literature to be absolutely necessary insofar as the criticism does not run counter to the class and revolutionary character of this theory," unquote. And the motivation? The resolution, quote, "in its first part coincides with the resolution of the Lubeck Party Congress on Bernstein. In the simplicity of their souls, the Unionists failed to observe what a testimonium pauperatus, attestation of poverty, they betray with this copying. But, in its second part, it restricts freedom of criticism much more than did the Lubeck Party Congress." The resolution of the Union abroad, then, is directed against the Russian Bernsteinians? If it is not, then the reference to Lubeck would be utterly absurd. But it is not true to say that it restricts freedom of criticism. In adopting their Hanover Resolution, the Germans, point by point, rejected precisely the amendments proposed by Bernstein, while in their Lubeck Resolution they cautioned Bernstein personally by naming him. Our free imitators, however, make not a single allusion to a single manifestation of specifically Russian criticism and Russian economism. In view of this omission, the bare reference to the class and revolutionary character of the theory leaves far wider scope for misinterpretation, particularly when the Union abroad refuses to identify, quote, so-called economism with opportunism. But all this in passing. The main thing to note is that the positions of the opportunists in relation to the revolutionary social democrats in Russia are diametrically opposed to those in Germany. In that country, as we know, the revolutionary social democrats are in favor of preserving that which exists, the old program and the tactics, which are universally known and have been elucidated in all their details by many decades of experience. But the critics desire to introduce changes, and since these critics represent an insignificant minority, and since they are very timid in their revisionist efforts, one can understand the motives of the majority in confining themselves to their dry rejection of innovations. In Russia, however, it is the critics and the economists who are in favor of preserving that which exists. The critics want us to go on regarding them as Marxists and to guarantee them the freedom of criticism they enjoyed to the full, for in fact, they never recognized any kind of party ties. And moreover, we never had a generally recognized party body that could restrict freedom of criticism, if only by counsel. The economists want the revolutionaries to recognize the sovereign character of the present moment, as said in Robochia Dielo number 10, i.e. to recognize the, quote, legitimacy of that which exists. They want the, quote, ideologists not to try to, quote, divert the movement from the path that, quote, is determined by the interaction of material elements and material environment. They want to have that struggle recognized as desirable, quote, which it is possible for the workers to wage under the present conditions, and as the only possible struggle, that, quote, which they are actually waging at the present time. We revolutionary social democrats, on the contrary, are dissatisfied with this worship of spontaneity, i.e. of that which exists at the present moment. We demand that the tactics that have prevailed in recent years be changed. We declare that, quote, before we can unite, and in order that we may unite, we must first of all draw firm and definite lines of demarcation. In a word, the Germans stand for that which exists and reject changes. We demand a change of that which exists and reject subservience thereto and reconciliation to it. This, quote, slight difference our, quote, free copyists of German resolutions failed to notice. And a quick comment from S4A, that was the end of section 1.3. Lenin has used the term economism here a lot, and there is kind of an explanation of that, but if you're confused about economism, it is less a revolutionary aim and more just the struggle for, like a trade unionist struggle for just better wages and sort of, limited thinking improvements of job conditions rather than a revolutionary socialist worldview. Just, particular things that you can lobby for on a shop floor in terms of hours and conditions and pay and safety and things like that. If you're interested in an example of a labor union that wasn't purely economist in its thinking, the IWW of the early days, it was founded actually right around this time in 1905. Industrial Workers of the World, or Wobblies as they were called, is a labor union that did fight for day-to-day short-term gains like better hours and pay, but they also had in mind the overthrow of capitalism and a cooperative economy. So, there's nothing that says labor unions have to be purely economists, so hence the attacks here. All right, so back to the text, section 1.4, Engels on the importance of the theoretical struggle. Dogmatism, doctrinarism, ossification of the party, the inevitable retribution that follows the violent straight-lacing of thought. These are the enemies against which the knightly champions of freedom of criticism in Roboche Dielo rise up in arms. We are very glad that this question has been placed on the order of the day, and we would only propose to add it to one other. And who are the judges? We have before us two publishers' announcements. One, the program of the periodical organ of the Union of Russian Social Democrats Abroad, Roboche Dielo, and the other, the announcement of the resumption of the publications of the Emancipation of Labor Group. Both are dated 1899, when the crisis of Marxism had long been under discussion. And what do we find? We would seek in vain in the first announcement for any reference to this phenomenon, or a definite statement of the position the new organ intends to adopt on this question. Not a word is said about theoretical work and the urgent tasks that now confront it, either in this program or in the supplements to it that were adopted by the Third Congress of the Union Abroad in 1901. During this entire time, the editorial board of Roboche Dielo ignored theoretical questions, in spite of the fact that these were questions that disturbed the minds of all social democrats the world over. The other announcement, on the contrary, points first of all to the declining interest in theory in recent years, imperatively demands, quote, vigilant attention to the theoretical aspect of the revolutionary movement of the proletariat, and calls for, quote, ruthless criticism of the Bernsteinian and other anti-revolutionary tendencies in our movement. The issues of Zarya to date show how this program has been carried out. Thus we see that high-sounding phrases against the ossification of thought, etc., conceal unconcern and helplessness with regard to the development of theoretical thought. The case of the Russian Social Democrats manifestly illustrates the general European phenomenon, long ago noted also by the German Marxists, that the much vaunted freedom of criticism does not imply substitution of one theory for another, but freedom from all integral and pondered theory. It implies eclecticism and lack of principle. Those who have the slightest acquaintance with the actual state of our movement cannot but see that the widespread of Marxism was accompanied by a certain lowering of the theoretical level. Quite a number of people with very little and even a total lack of theoretical training joined the movement because of its practical significance and its practical successes. We can judge from that how tactless Roboche Dielo is when, with an air of triumph, it quotes Marx's statement, quote, every step of real movement is more important than a dozen programs. To repeat these words in a period of theoretical disorder is like wishing mourners at a funeral many happy returns of the day. Moreover, these words of Marx are taken from his letter on the Gotha program, in which he sharply condemns eclecticism in the formulation of principles. If you must unite, Marx wrote to the party leaders, then enter into agreements to satisfy the practical aims of the movement, but do not allow any bargaining over principles. Do not make theoretical concessions. This was Marx's idea, and yet there are people amongst us who seek in his name to belittle the significance of theory. Without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement. This idea cannot be insisted upon too strongly at a time when the fashionable preaching of opportunism goes hand in hand with an infatuation for the narrowest forms of practical activity. Yet, for Russian Social Democrats, the importance of theory is enhanced by three other circumstances which are often forgotten. First, by the fact that our party is only in process of formation. Its features are only just becoming defined, and it has as yet far from settled accounts with the other trends of revolutionary thought that threaten to divert the movement from the correct path. On the contrary, precisely the very recent past was marked by a revival of non-social democratic revolutionary trends, an eventuation regarding which Axelrod long ago warned the economists. Under these circumstances, what at first sight appears to be an unimportant error may lead to most deplorable consequences, and only short-sighted people can consider factional disputes and a strict differentiation between shades of opinion inopportune or superfluous. The fate of Russian social democracy for very many years to come may depend on the strengthening of one or the other shade. Secondly, the social democratic movement is in its very essence an international movement. This means not only that we must combat national chauvinism, but that an incipient movement in a young country can be successful only if it makes use of the experiences of other countries. In order to make use of these experiences, it is not enough merely to be acquainted with them, or simply to copy out the latest resolutions. What is required is the ability to treat these experiences critically and to test them independently. He who realizes how enormously the modern working class movement has grown and branched out will understand what a reserve of theoretical forces and political, as well as revolutionary, experience is required to carry out this task. Thirdly, the national tasks of Russian social democracy are such as have never confronted any other socialist party in the world. We shall have occasion further on to deal with the political and organizational duties which the task of emancipating the whole people from the yoke of autocracy imposes upon us. At this point, we wish to state only that the role of vanguard fighter can be fulfilled only by a party that is guided by the most advanced theory. To have a concrete understanding of what this means, let the reader recall such predecessors of Russian social democracy as Herzen, Belinsky, Chernyshevsky, and the brilliant galaxy of revolutionaries of the 70s. Let him ponder over the world significance which Russian literature is now acquiring. Let him, but be that enough? Let us quote what Engels said in 1874 concerning the significance of theory in the social democratic movement. Engels recognizes not two forms of the great struggle of social democracy, political and economic, as is the fashion among us, but three, placing the theoretical struggle on a par with the first two. His recommendations to the German working class movement, which had become strong, practically and politically, are so instructive from the standpoint of present-day problems and controversies that we hope the reader will not be vexed with us for quoting a long passage from his prefatory note to Der Deutsche Bauernkrieg, which has long become a great bibliographical rarity. Quote, "The German workers have two important advantages over those of the rest of Europe. First, they belong to the most theoretical people of Europe, and they have retained that sense of theory which the so-called educated classes of Germany have almost completely lost. Without German philosophy, which preceded it, particularly that of Hegel, German scientific socialism, the only scientific socialism that has ever existed, would never have come into being. Without a sense of theory among the workers, this scientific socialism would never have entered their flesh and blood as much as is the case. What an immeasurable advantage this is may be seen, on the one hand, from the indifference towards all theory, which is one of the main reasons why the English working class movement crawls along so slowly in spite of the splendid organization of the individual unions. On the other hand, from the mischief and confusion wrought by Proudhonism in its original form among the French and Belgians, and in the form further caricatured by Bakunin under the Spaniards and Italians. The second advantage is that, chronologically speaking, the Germans were about the last to come into the workers' movement. Just as German theoretical socialism will never forget that it rests on the soldiers of Saint-Simon, Fourier, and Owen, three men who, in spite of all their fantastic notions and all their utopianism, have their place among the most eminent thinkers of all times, and whose genius anticipated innumerable things, the correctness of which is now being scientifically proved by us. So the practical workers' movement in Germany ought never to forget that it has developed on the shoulders of the English and French movements, that it was able simply to utilize their dearly bought experience and could now avoid their mistakes, which in their time were mostly unavoidable. Without the precedent of the English trade unions and French workers' political struggles, without the gigantic impulse given especially by the Paris Commune, where would we be now? It must be said to the credit of the German workers that they have exploited the advantages of their situation with rare understanding. For the first time since a workers' movement has existed, the struggle is being conducted pursuant to its three sides: the theoretical, the political, and the practical economic, resistance to the capitalists, in harmony and in its interconnections, and in a systemic way. It is precisely in this, as it were, concentric attack that the strength and invincibility of the German movement lies. Due to this advantageous situation on the one hand, and to the insular peculiarities of the English and the forcible suppression of the French movement on the other, The German workers have for the moment been placed in the vanguard of the proletarian struggle. How long events will allow them to occupy this post of honor cannot be foretold, but let us hope that as long as they do occupy it, they will fill it fittingly. This demands redoubled efforts in every field of struggle and agitation. In particular, it will be the duty of the leaders to gain an ever clearer insight into all theoretical questions, to free themselves more and more from the influence of traditional phrases inherited from the old world outlook, and constantly to keep in mind that socialism, since it has become a science, demands that it be pursued as a science, i.e. that it be studied. The task will be to spread with increased zeal among the masses of the workers the ever more clarified understanding thus acquired, to knit together ever more firmly the organization both of the party and of the trade unions. If the German workers progress in this way, they will not be marching exactly at the head of the movement. It is not at all in the interest of this movement that the workers of any particular country should march at its head, but they will occupy an honorable place in the battle line, and they will stand armed for battle when either unexpectedly grave trials or momentous events demand of them increased courage, increased determination, and energy. That's ending the quote from Engels. Back to Lenin. Engels' words proved prophetic. Within a few years, the German workers were subjected to unexpectedly grave trials in the form of the exceptional law against the socialists. And they met those trials armed for battle and succeeded in emerging from them victorious. The Russian proletariat will have to undergo trials immeasurably graver. It will have to fight a monster compared with which an anti-socialist law in a constitutional country seems but a dwarf. History has now confronted us with an immediate task which is the most revolutionary of all the immediate tasks confronting the proletariat of any country. The fulfillment of this task, the destruction of the most powerful bulwark, not only of European, but it may now be said of Asiatic reaction, would make the Russian proletariat the vanguard of the international revolutionary proletariat. And we have the right to count upon acquiring this honorable title, already earned by our predecessors, the revolutionaries of the 70s, if we succeed in inspiring our movement, which is 1,000 times broader and deeper, with the same devoted determination and vigor. Chapter 2. The spontaneity of the masses and the consciousness of the Social Democrats. We have said that our movement, much more extensive and deep than the movement of the 70s, must be inspired with the same devoted determination and energy that inspired the movement at that time. Indeed, no one, we think, has until now doubted that the strength of the present-day movement lies in the awakening of the masses, principally the industrial proletariat, and that its weaknesses lie in the lack of consciousness and initiative among the revolutionary leaders. However, of late, a staggering discovery has been made, which threatens to disestablish all hitherto prevailing views on this question. This discovery was made by Rабочее дело, which in its polemic with Iskra and Zarya did not confine itself to making objections on separate points, but tried to ascribe, quote, general disagreements to a more profound cause, to the, quote, different appraisals of the relative importance of the spontaneous and consciously methodical element. Rabочее дело formulated its indictment as a, quote, belittling of the significance of the objective or the spontaneous element of development. To this we say, had the polemics with Iskra and Zarya resulted in nothing more than causing Rabочее дело to hit upon these, quote, general disagreements, that alone would give us considerable satisfaction. So significant is this thesis, and so clear is the light it sheds on the quintessence of the present-day theoretical and political differences that exist among Russian social democrats. For this reason, the question of the relation between consciousness and spontaneity is of such enormous general interest, and for this reason the question must be dealt with in great detail. Section 2.1, the beginning of the spontaneous upsurge. In the previous chapter, we pointed out how universally absorbed the educated youth of Russia was in the theories of Marxism in the middle of the 90s. In the same period, the strikes that followed the famous St. Petersburg Industrial War of 1896 assumed a similar general character. Their spread over the whole of Russia clearly showed the depth of the newly awakening popular movement, And if we are to speak of the, quote, spontaneous element, then of course it is this strike movement which, first and foremost, must be regarded as spontaneous. But there is spontaneity and spontaneity. Strikes occurred in Russia in the 70s and 60s, and even in the first half of the 19th century, and they were accompanied by the spontaneous destruction of machinery, etc. Compared with these revolts, the strikes of the 90s might even be described as conscious. To such an extent do they mark the progress which the working class movement made in that period. This shows that the, quote, spontaneous element, in essence, represents nothing more nor less than consciousness in an embryonic form. Even the primitive revolts expressed the awakening of consciousness to a certain extent. The workers were losing their age-long faith in the permanence of the system which oppressed them and began, I shall not say to understand, but to sense the necessity for collective resistance, definitely abandoning their slavish submission to the authorities. But this was, nevertheless, more in the nature of outbursts of desperation and vengeance than of struggle. The strikes of the 90s revealed far greater flashes of consciousness. Definite demands were advanced, the strike was carefully timed, known cases and instances in other places were discussed, etc. The revolts were simply the resistance of the oppressed, whereas the systematic strikes represented the class struggle in embryo, but only in embryo. Taken by themselves, these strikes were simply trade union struggles, not yet social democratic struggles. They marked the awakening antagonisms between workers and employers, but the workers were not and could not be conscious of the irreconcilable antagonism of their interests to the whole of the modern political and social system, i.e., theirs was not yet social democratic consciousness. In this sense, the strikes of the 90s, despite the enormous progress they represented as compared with the revolts, remained a purely spontaneous movement. We have said that there could not have been social democratic consciousness among the workers. It would have to be brought to them from without. The history of all countries shows that the working class, exclusively by its own effort, is able to develop only trade union consciousness, i.e., the conviction that it is necessary to combine in unions, fight the employers, and strive to compel the government to pass necessary labor legislation, etc. The theory of socialism, however, grew out of the philosophic, historical, and economic theories elaborated by educated representatives of the propertied classes, by intellectuals. By their social status, the founders of modern scientific socialism, Marx and Engels, themselves belonged to the bourgeois intelligentsia. In the very same way, in Russia, the theoretical doctrine of social democracy arose altogether independently of the spontaneous growth of the working class movement. It arose as a natural and inevitable outcome of the development of thought among the revolutionary socialist intelligentsia. In the period under discussion, the middle 90s, this doctrine not only represented the completely formulated program of the emancipation of labor group, but had already won over to its side the majority of the revolutionary youth in Russia. Hence we had both the spontaneous awakening of the working masses, their awakening to conscious life and conscious struggle, and a revolutionary youth armed with social democratic theory and straining towards the workers. In this connection, it is particularly important to state the oft-forgotten and comparatively little-known fact that although the early social democrats of that period zealously carried on economic agitation, being guided in this activity by the truly useful indications contained in the pamphlet on agitation, then still in manuscript, they did not regard this as their sole task. On the contrary, from the very beginning, they set for Russian social democracy the most far-reaching historical tasks in general, and the task of overthrowing the autocracy in particular. Thus, toward the end of 1895, the St. Petersburg group of Social Democrats, which founded the League of Struggle for the Emancipation of the Working Class, prepared the first issue of a newspaper called Рабочее Дело. This issue was ready to go to press when it was seized by the gendarmes on the night of December 8, 1895, in a raid on the house of one of the members of the group, Anatoly Alexeyevich Vaneyey, V-A-N-E-Y-E-Y, so that the first edition of Рабочее Дело was not destined to see the light of day. The leading article in this issue, which perhaps 30 years hence some Ruskaya Starina will unearth in the archives of the Department of Police, outlined the historical tasks of the working class in Russia and placed the achievement of political liberty at their head. The issue also contained an article entitled, "What Are Our Ministers Thinking About?", which dealt with the crushing of the elementary education committees by the police. In addition, there was some correspondence from St. Petersburg and from other parts of Russia, e.g. a letter on the massacre of the workers in Yaroslavl Gubernia. This first effort, if we are not mistaken, of the Russian Social Democrats of the 90s, was not a purely local, or less still economic, newspaper, but one that aimed to unite the strike movement with the revolutionary movement against the autocracy, and to win over to the side of social democracy all who were oppressed by the policy of reactionary obscurantism. No one in the slightest degree acquainted with the state of the movement at that period could doubt that such a paper would have met with warm response among the workers of the capital and the revolutionary intelligentsia, and would have had a wide circulation. The failure of the enterprise merely showed that the Social Democrats of that period were unable to meet the immediate requirements of the time owing to their lack of revolutionary experience and practical training. This must be said too with regard to the S. Petersburgsky Rabochi Listok, and particularly with regard to Rabochia Gazeta and the manifesto of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party founded in the spring of 1898. Of course, we would not dream of blaming the Social Democrats of that time for this unpreparedness. But in order to profit from the experience of that movement and to draw practical lessons from it, we must thoroughly understand the causes and significance of this or that shortcoming. It is therefore highly important to establish the fact that a part, or perhaps even a majority, of the Social Democrats active in the period of 1895 to 98 justly considered it possible even then, at the very beginning of the spontaneous movement, to come forward with a most extensive program and a militant tactical line. Lack of training of the majority of the revolutionaries, an entirely natural phenomenon, could not have roused any particular fears. Once the tasks were correctly defined, once the energy existed for repeated attempts to fulfill them, temporary failures represented only part misfortune. Revolutionary experience and organizational skill are things that can be acquired, provided the desire is there to acquire them, provided the shortcomings are recognized, in which revolutionary activity is more than halfway towards their removal. But what was only part misfortune became full misfortune when this consciousness began to grow dim. It was very much alive among the members of the groups mentioned. When there appeared people, and even social democratic organs, that were prepared to regard shortcomings as virtues, that even tried to invent a theoretical basis for their slavish cringing before spontaneity. It is time to draw conclusions from this trend, the content of which is incorrectly and too narrowly characterized as economism. Section 2.2, Bowing to Spontaneity, Rabochia Missile. Before dealing with the literary manifestation of this subservience to spontaneity, we should like to note the following characteristic fact communicated to us from the above-mentioned source, which throws light on the conditions in which the two future conflicting trends in Russian social democracy arose and grew among the comrades working in St. Petersburg. In the beginning of 1897, just prior to their banishment, A.A. Veneyev and several of his comrades attended a private meeting at which old and young members of the League of Struggle for the Emancipation of Working Class gathered. The conversation centered chiefly about the question of organization, particularly about the rules for the Workers' Mutual Benefit Fund, which in their final form were published in Listok Robotnika, number 9 through 10. Sharp differences immediately showed themselves between the old members, Decembrists as the St. Petersburg Social Democrats jestingly called them, and several young members who subsequently took an active part in the work of Rabochia Missile, with a heated discussion ensuing. The young members defended the main principles of the rules in the form in which they were published. The old members contended that the prime necessity was not this, but the consolidation of the League of Struggle into an organization of revolutionaries, to which all the various workers' mutual benefit funds, students' propaganda circles, etc. should be subordinated. It goes without saying that the disputing sides far from realized at the time that these disagreements were the beginning of a cleavage. On the contrary, they regarded them as something isolated and casual. But this fact shows that in Russia, too, economism did not arise and spread without a struggle against the old social democrats, which the economists of today are apt to forget. And if, in the main, this struggle has not left documentary traces behind it, it is solely because the membership of the circles then functioning underwent such constant change that no continuity was established, and consequently differences in points of view were not recorded in any documents. The founding of Rабочая Мысль brought economism to the light of day, but not at one stroke. We must picture to ourselves concretely the conditions for activity and the short-lived character of the majority of the Russian study circles, a thing that is possible only for those who have themselves experienced it, in order to understand how much there was of the fortuitous in the successes and failures of the new trend in various towns, and the length of time during which neither the advocates nor the opponents of the, quote, new could make up their minds, and literally had no opportunity of so doing, as to whether this really expressed a distinct trend or merely the lack of training of certain individuals. For example, the first mimeographed copies of Rабочая Мысль never reached the great majority of social democrats. And if we are able to refer to the leading article in the first number, it is only because it was reproduced in an article by V.I., who, of course, did not fail to extol with more zeal than reason the new paper, which was so different from the papers and projects for papers mentioned above. It is well worth dwelling on this leading article because it brings out in bold relief the entire spirit of Rабочая Мысль and economism generally. After stating that the arm of the, quote, bluecoats could never halt the progress of the working class movement, the leading article goes on to say, quote, the virility of the working class movement is due to the fact that the workers themselves are at last taking their fate into their own hands and out of the hands of the leaders. This fundamental crisis is then developed in greater detail. Actually, the leaders, i.e. the Social Democrats, the organizers of the League of Struggle, were, one might say, torn out of the hands of the workers by the police. Yet it is made to appear that the workers were fighting against the leaders and liberated themselves from their yoke. Instead of sounding the call to go forward towards the consolidation of the revolutionary organization and the expansion of political activity, the call was issued for a retreat to the purely trade union struggle. It was announced that, quote, the economic basis of the movement is eclipsed by the effort never to forget the political ideal, unquote, and that the watchword for the working class movement was struggle for economic conditions, or better still, the workers for the workers. It was declared that strike funds, quote, are more valuable to the movement than 100 other organizations. Compare this statement made in October 1897 with the polemic between the Decembrists and the young members in the beginning of 1897, etc. Catch words like, we must concentrate not on the cream of the workers, but on the average mass worker. Politics always obediently follows economics, etc., became the fashion, exercising an irresistible influence upon the masses of the youth who were attracted to the movement, but who, in the majority of cases, were acquainted only with such fragments of Marxism as were expounded in legally appearing publications. Political consciousness was completely overwhelmed by spontaneity, the spontaneity of the Social Democrats who repeated Mr. VV's ideas, the spontaneity of those workers who were carried away by the arguments that a kopeck added to a ruble was worth more than any socialism or politics, and that they must, quote, fight, knowing that they are fighting not for the sake of some future generation, but for themselves and their children, unquote. Phrases like these have always been a favorite weapon of the West European bourgeois, who, in their hatred for socialism, strove, like the German Sozialpolitiker Hirsch, to transplant English trade unionism to their native soil and to preach to the workers that by engaging in the purely trade union struggle, they would be fighting for themselves and for their children and not for some future generations with some future socialism. And now the VVs of Russian social democracy have set about repeating these bourgeois phrases. It is important at this point to note three circumstances that will be useful to our further analysis of contemporary differences. In the first place, the overwhelming of political consciousness by spontaneity, to which we referred above, also took place spontaneously. This may sound like a pun, but alas, it is the bitter truth. It did not take place as the result of an open struggle between two diametrically opposed points of view in which one triumphed over the other. It occurred because of the fact that an increasing number of old revolutionaries were torn away by the gendarmes and increasing number of young VVs of Russian social democracy appeared on the scene. Everyone who has, I shall not say participated in, but at least breathed the atmosphere of the present-day Russian movement, knows perfectly well that this is precisely the case. And if, nevertheless, we insist strongly that the reader be fully clear on this generally known fact, if we cite, for explicitness, as it were, the facts of the first edition of Рабочее Дело and of the polemic between the old and the young at the beginning of 1897, we do this because the people who vaunt their democracy speculate on the ignorance of these facts on the part of the broad public, or of the very young generation. We shall return to this point further on. Secondly, in the very first literary expression of economism, we observe the exceedingly curious phenomenon, highly characteristic for an understanding of all the differences prevailing among present-day social democrats, that the adherents of the, quote, labor movement pure and simple, worshippers of the closest, quote, organic contacts, Рабочее Дело's term, with the proletarian struggle, opponents of any non-worker intelligentsia, even a socialist intelligentsia, are compelled, in order to defend their positions, to resort to the arguments of the bourgeois, quote, pure trade unionists. This shows that from the very outset, Рабочая Мысль began unconsciously to implement the program of the Credo. This shows, something Рабочее Дело cannot grasp, that all worship of the spontaneity of the working class movement, all belittling of the role of the conscious element, of the role of social democracy, means, quite independently of whether he who belittles that role desires it or not, a strengthening of the influence of bourgeois ideology upon the workers. All those who talk about, quote, overrating the importance of ideology, about exaggerating the role of the conscious element, etc., imagine that the labor movement, pure and simple, can elaborate, and will elaborate, an independent ideology for itself, if only the workers, quote, wrest their fate from the hands of the leaders. But this is a profound mistake. To supplant what has been said above, we shall quote the following profoundly true and important words of Karl Kautsky on the new draft program of the Austrian Social Democratic Party. Quote, many of our revisionist critics believe that Marx asserted that economic development and the class struggle create not only the conditions for socialist production, but also, and directly, the consciousness of its necessity. And these critics assert that England, the country most highly developed capitalistically, is more remote than any other from this consciousness. Judging by the draft, one might assume that this allegedly orthodox Marxist view, which is thus refuted, was shared by the committee that drafted the Austrian program. In the draft program, it is stated, quote, the more capitalist development increases the numbers of the proletariat, the more the proletariat is compelled and becomes fit to fight against capitalism. The proletariat becomes conscious of the possibility and of the necessity for socialism. In this connection, socialist consciousness appears to be a necessary and direct result of the proletarian class struggle. But this is absolutely untrue. Of course, socialism as a doctrine has its roots in modern economic relationships, just as the class struggle of the proletariat has, and, like the latter, emerges from the struggle against the capitalist-created poverty and misery of the masses. But socialism and the class struggle arise side by side and not one out of the other. Each arises under different conditions. Modern socialist consciousness can arise only on the basis of profound scientific knowledge. Indeed, modern economic science is as much a condition for socialist production as, say, modern technology, and the proletariat can create neither the one nor the other, no matter how much it may desire to do so. Both arise out of the modern social process. The vehicle of science is not the proletariat, but the bourgeois intelligentsia. It was in the minds of individual members of this stratum that modern socialism originated, and it was they who communicated it to the more intellectually developed proletarians, who in their turn introduce it to the proletarian class struggle where conditions allow that to be done. Thus, socialist consciousness is something introduced into the proletarian class struggle from without, and not something that arose within it spontaneously. Accordingly, the old Hainfield program quite rightly stated that the task of social democracy is to imbue the proletariat, literally saturate the proletariat, with the consciousness of its position and the consciousness of its task. There would be no need for this if consciousness arose of itself from the class struggle. The new draft copied this proposition from the old program and attached it to the proposition mentioned above. But this completely broke the line of thought, unquote. Since there can be no talk of an independent ideology formulated by the working masses themselves in the process of their movement, the only choice is either bourgeois or socialist ideology. There is no middle course, for mankind has not created a third ideology, and moreover, in a society torn by class antagonisms, there can never be a non-class or an above-class ideology. Hence, to belittle the socialist ideology in any way, to turn aside from it in the slightest degree, means to strengthen bourgeois ideology. There is much talk of spontaneity, but the spontaneous development of the working class movement leads to its subordination to bourgeois ideology, to its development along the lines of the Credo program. For the spontaneous working class movement is trade unionism, is nur Gewerkschaftlerei, and trade unionism means the ideological enslavement of the workers by the bourgeoisie. Hence, our task, the task of social democracy, is to combat spontaneity, to divert the working class movement from this spontaneous trade unionist striving to come under the wing of the bourgeoisie, and to bring it under the wing of revolutionary social democracy. The sentence employed by the authors of the Economist letter published in Iskra number 12, that the efforts of the most inspired ideologists fail to divert the working class movement from the path that is determined by the interaction of the material elements and the material environment, is therefore tantamount to renouncing socialism. If these authors were capable of fearlessly, consistently, and thoroughly considering what they say, as everyone who enters the arena of literary and public activity should be, there would be nothing left for them but to, quote, fold their useless arms over their empty breasts and surrender the field of action to the Struves and the Prokopoviches, who are dragging the working class movement, quote, along the line of least resistance, i.e., along the line of bourgeois trade unionism, or to the Zubatovs, who are dragging it along the line of clerical and gendarme, quote, ideology. Let us recall the example of Germany. What was the historic service Lassalle rendered to the German working class movement? It was that he diverted that movement from the path of progressionist trade unionism and cooperativism, toward which it had been spontaneously moving, with the benign assistance of Schulze Delitzsch and his like. To fulfill such a task, it was necessary to do something quite different from talking of underrating the spontaneous element, of tactics as process, of the interaction between elements and environment, etc. A fierce struggle against spontaneity was necessary, and only after such a struggle, extending over many years, was it possible, for instance, to convert the working population of Berlin from a bulwark of the Progressionist Party into one of the finest strongholds of social democracy. This struggle is by no means over even today, as might seem to those who learn the history of the German movement from Prokopovich and its philosophy from Struve. Even now, the German working class is, so to speak, split up among a number of ideologies. A section of the workers is organized in Catholic and monarchist trade unions. Another section is organized in the Hirsch-Dürcker unions, founded by the bourgeois worshippers of English trade unionism. The third is organized in social democratic trade unions. The last named group is immeasurably more numerous than the rest, but the social democratic ideology was able to achieve this superiority and will be able to maintain it only in an unswerving struggle against all other ideologies. But why, the reader will ask, does the spontaneous movement, the movement along the line of least resistance, lead to the domination of bourgeois ideology? For the simple reason that bourgeois ideology is far older in origin than socialist ideology, that it is more fully developed, and that it has at its disposal immeasurably more means of dissemination. And the younger the socialist movement in any given country, the more vigorously it must struggle against all attempts to entrench non-socialist ideology, and the more resolutely the workers must be warned against the bad counselors who shout against, quote, overrating the conscious element, etc. The authors of The Economist letter, in union with Rabotchi Diello, inveigh against the intolerance that is characteristic of the infancy of the movement. To this we reply, yes, our movement is indeed in its infancy, and in order that it may grow up faster, it must become imbued with intolerance against those who retard its growth by their subservience to spontaneity. Nothing is so ridiculous and so harmful as pretending that we are, quote, old hands who have long ago experienced all the decisive stages of the struggle. Thirdly, the first issue of Rabotchi Missal shows that the term economism, which of course we do not propose to abandon since in one way or another this designation has already established itself, does not adequately convey the real character of the new trend. Rabotchi Missal does not altogether repudiate the political struggle. The rules for a workers' mutual benefit fund published in its first issue contain a reference to combating the government. Rabotchi Missal believes, however, that, quote, politics always obediently follows economics. Rabotchi Diello varies this thesis when it asserts in its program that, quote, in Russia more than in any other country, the economic struggle is inseparable from the political struggle. If by politics is meant social democratic politics, then the theses of Rabotchi Missal and Rabotchi Diello are utterly incorrect. The economic struggle of the workers is very often connected, though not inseparably, with bourgeois politics, clerical politics, etc., as we have seen. Rabotchi Diello's theses are correct if by politics is meant trade union politics, vis-a-vis the common striving of all workers to secure from the government measures for alleviating the distress to which their conditions give rise, but which do not abolish that condition, i.e. which do not remove the subjection of labor to capital. That striving, indeed, is common to the English trade unionists, who are hostile to socialism, to the Catholic workers, to the Zubetov workers, etc. There is politics and politics. Thus we see that the Rabotchi Missal does not so much deny the political struggle as it bows to its spontaneity, to its unconsciousness. While fully recognizing the political struggle, better, the political desires and demands of the workers, which arises spontaneously from the working class movement itself, it absolutely refuses independently to work out a specifically social democratic politics corresponding to the general tasks of socialism and to present-day conditions in Russia. Further on, we shall show that Rabotchi Diello commits the same error. Section 2.3, the Self-Emancipation Group and Rabotchi Diello. We have dealt at such length with the little-known and now almost forgotten leading article in the first issue of Rabotchi Missal, because it was the first and most striking expression of that general stream of thought which afterwards emerged into the light of day in innumerable streamlets. VI was perfectly right when, in praising the first issue and the leading article of Rabotchi Missal, he said that the article had been written in a, quote, sharp and fervent manner. Every man with convictions who thinks he has something new to say writes fervently, and in such a way as to make his views stand out in bold relief. Only those who are accustomed to sitting between two stools lack fervor. Only such people are able to praise the fervor of Rabotchi Missal one day and attack the fervent polemics of its opponents the next. We shall not dwell on the separate supplement to Rabotchi Missal. Below we shall have occasion on various points to refer to this work, which expresses the ideas of the economists more consistently than any other. but shall briefly mention the Appeal of the Self-Emancipation of the Workers Group from March 1899. The authors of this appeal rightly say that, quote, the workers of Russia are only just awakening, are just beginning to look about them, and are instinctively clutching at the first available means of struggle, unquote. Yet they draw from this the same false conclusion as that drawn by Rabotchia Missile, forgetting that the instinctive is the unconscious, the spontaneous, to the aid of which socialists must come, that the, quote, first available means of struggle will always be, in modern society, the trade union means of struggle, and the, quote, first available ideology, the bourgeois trade union ideology. Similarly, these authors do not repudiate politics, they merely echo Mr. V.V. that politics is the superstructure, and therefore, quote, political agitation must be the superstructure to the agitation carried on in favor of the economic struggle. It must arise on the basis of this struggle and follow in its wake. As for Rabotchia Dielo, it began its activity with the defense of the economists. It stated a downright untruth in its opening issue in claiming that it, quote, does not know to which young comrades Axelrod referred, unquote, when he warned the economists in his well-known pamphlet. In the polemic that flared up with Axelrod and Plenketov over this untruth, Rabotchia Dielo had to admit that, quote, in form of perplexity, it sought to defend all the younger social democrats abroad from this unjust accusation, unquote, or in other words, the charge of narrowness leveled by Axelrod at the economists. In reality, this accusation was completely justified, and Rabotchia Dielo knew perfectly well that, among others, it applied also to VI, a member of its editorial board. Let me note in passing that in this polemic, Axelrod was entirely right and Rabotchia Dielo entirely wrong in their respective interpretations of my pamphlet, The Tasks of the Russian Social Democrats. The pamphlet was written in 1897 before the appearance of Rabotchia Missile, when I thought rightly that the original tendency of the St. Petersburg League of Struggle, which I characterized above, was dominant. And this tendency was dominant at least until the middle of 1898. Consequently, Rabotchia Dielo had no right whatever in its attempt to deny the existence and danger of economism, to refer to a pamphlet that expressed views forced out by economist views in St. Petersburg in 1897 and 1898. But Rabotchia Dielo not only defended the economists, it itself constantly fell into their fundamental errors. The source of this confusion is to be found in the ambiguity of the interpretation given to the following thesis of the Rabotchia Dielo program. Quote, we consider that the most important phenomenon of Russian life, the one that will mainly determine the tasks and the character of the publication activity of the Union, is the mass working class movement, which has arisen in recent years, unquote. That the mass movement is a most important phenomenon is a fact not to be disputed, but the crux of the matter is, how is one to understand the statement that the mass working class movement will, quote, determine the tasks? It may be interpreted in one of two ways. Either it means bowing to the spontaneity of this movement, i.e. reducing the role of social democracy to mere subservience to the working class movement as such, the interpretation of Rabotchia Missile, the self-emancipation group, and other economists. Or it means that the mass movement places before us new theoretical, political, and organizational tasks far more complicated than those that might have satisfied us in the period before the rise of the mass movement. Rabotchia Dielo inclined, and still inclines, toward the first interpretation, for it has said nothing definite about any new tasks, but has argued constantly as though the mass movement relieves us of the necessity of clearly understanding and fulfilling the tasks it sets before us. We need only point out that Rabotchia Dielo considered that it was impossible to set the overthrow of the autocracy as the first task of the mass working class movement, and that it degraded this task in the name of the mass movement to that of a struggle for immediate political demands. We shall pass over the article by B. Khrushchevsky, editor of Rabotchia Dielo, entitled The Economic and the Political Struggle in the Russian Movement, published in number 7 of that paper, in which these very mistakes are repeated, and proceed directly to Raboccia Dielo number 10. We shall not, of course, enter in detail into the various objections raised by Krzyzewski and Martinov against Zara and Iskra. We are here interested solely in the basis of principles on which Raboccia Dielo in its 10th issue took its stand. Thus, we shall not examine the strange fact that Raboccia Dielo saw a, quote, diametrical contradiction between the proposition, quote, social democracy does not tie its hands. It does not restrict its activities to some one preconceived plan or method of political struggle. It recognizes all means of struggle as long as they correspond to the forces at the disposal of the party, etc. And the proposition, quote, without a strong organization skilled in waging political struggle under all circumstances and at all times, there can be no question of that systematic plan of action, illumined by firm principles and steadfastly carried out, which alone is worthy of the name of tactics. To confound recognition in principle of all means of struggle, of all plans and methods, provided they are expedient, with the demand at a given political moment to be guided by a strictly observed plan, is tantamount, if we are to talk of tactics, to confounding the recognition by medical science of various methods of treating diseases with the necessity for adopting a certain definite method of treatment for a given disease. The point is, however, that Raboccia Dielo, itself the victim of a disease which we have called bowing to spontaneity, refuses to recognize any method of treatment for that disease. Hence, it has made the remarkable discovery that, quote, tactics as planned contradicts the fundamental spirit of Marxism, unquote. That tactics are, quote, a process of growth of party tasks which grow together with the party, unquote. This remark has every chance of becoming a celebrated maxim, a permanent monument to the Raboccia Dielo, quote, trend. To the question whither, the leading organ replies, movement is a process of changing the distance between the starting point and subsequent points of the movement. This matchless example of profundity is not merely a curiosity. Were it that, it would not be worth dealing with at length, but the program of a whole trend, the very program which R.M., in the separate supplement to Raboccia Missal, expressed in the words, that struggle is desirable which is possible, and the struggle which is possible is that which is going on at the given moment. This is precisely the trend of unbounded opportunism, which passively adapts itself to spontaneity. Tactics as planned contradicts the essence of Marxism, but this is a slander of Marxism. It means turning Marxism into the caricature held up by the Narodniks in their struggle against us. It means belittling the initiative and energy of class-conscious fighters, whereas Marxism, on the contrary, gives a gigantic impetus to the initiative and energy of the social democrat, opens him up for the widest perspectives, and, if one may so express it, places at his disposal the mighty force of many millions of workers, quote, spontaneously rising for the struggle. The entire history of international social democracy teems with plans, advanced now by one, now by another political leader, some confirming the farsightedness and the correct political and organizational views of their authors, and others revealing their short-sightedness and their political errors. At the time when Germany was at one of the crucial turning points in its history, the formation of the empire, the opening of the Reichstag, and the granting of universal suffrage, Liebknecht had one plan for social democratic politics and work in general, and Schweitzer had another. When the anti-socialist law came down on the heads of the German socialists, Most and Hasselmann had one plan. They were prepared then and there to call for violence and terror. Hochberg, Schramm, and partly Bernstein had another. They began to preach to the Social Democrats that they themselves had provoked the enactment of the law by being unreasonably bitter and revolutionary, and must now earn forgiveness by their exemplary conduct. There was yet a third plan proposed by those who prepared and carried out the publication of an illegal organ. It is easy, of course, with hindsight, many years after the struggle over the selection of the path to be followed, and after history has pronounced its verdict as to the expediency of the path selected, to utter profound maxims about the growth of party tasks which grow together with the party. But at a time of confusion, when the Russian critics and economists are degrading social democracy to the level of trade unionism, and when the terrorists are strongly advocating the adoption of tactics as planned that repeats the old mistakes, at such a time to confine oneself to profundities of this kind means simply to issue to oneself a, quote, certificate of poverty. At a time when many Russian social democrats suffer from a lack of initiative and energy, from an inadequate, quote, scope of political propaganda, agitation, and organization, from a lack of plans for a broader organization of revolutionary work, at such a time to declare that tactics as planned contradicts the essence of Marxism means not only to vulgarize Marxism in the realm of theory, but to drag the party backward in practice. Rabotchi Diallo goes on to sermonize, quote, "The task of the revolutionary social democrat is only to accelerate objective developments by his conscious work, not to obviate it or substitute his own subjective plans for this development." Iskra knows all about this in theory, but the enormous importance which Marxism justly attaches to conscious revolutionary work causes it in practice, owing to its doctrinaire view of tactics, to belittle the significance of the objective or the spontaneous element of development, unquote. Another example of the extraordinary theoretical confusion worthy of Mr. VV and his fraternity. We would ask our philosopher, how may a designer of subjective plans, quote, belittle objective development? Obviously, by losing sight of the fact that this objective development creates or strengthens, destroys or weakens certain classes, strata, or groups, certain nations or groups of nations, etc., and in this way serves to determine a given international political alignment of forces or the position adopted by revolutionary parties, etc. If the designer of plans did that, his guilt would not be that he belittled the spontaneous element, but on the contrary, that he belittled the conscious element. For he would then show that he lacked the, quote, consciousness properly to understand objective development. Hence, the very talk of, quote, estimating the relative significance of spontaneity and consciousness itself reveals a complete lack of consciousness. If certain, quote, spontaneous elements of development can be grasped at all by human understanding, then an incorrect estimation of them will be tantamount to, quote, belittling the conscious element. But if they cannot be grasped, then we do not know them and therefore cannot speak of them. What then is Khrushchevsky discussing if he thinks that Iskra's, quote, subjective plans are erroneous, as in fact he declares them to be? He should have shown what objective facts they ignore, and only then charge Iskra with lacking political consciousness for ignoring them, with, quote, belittling the conscious element, to use his own words. If, however, displeased with subjective plans, he can bring forward no argument other than that of, quote, belittling the spontaneous element, he merely shows, one, that theoretically he understands Marxism a la Karyev and Mikhailovsky, who have been sufficiently ridiculed by Beltov, and two, that practically he is quite satisfied with the, quote, spontaneous elements of development that have drawn our legal Marxists towards Bernsteinism and our social democrats towards economism, and that he is, quote, full of wrath against those who have determined at all costs to divert Russian social democracy from the path of, quote, spontaneous development. Further, there follow things that are positively droll. Quote, just as human beings will reproduce in the old-fashioned way despite all the discoveries of natural science, so the birth of a new social order will come about in the future too, mainly as a result of elemental outbursts, despite all the discoveries of social science and the increase in the number of conscious fighters, unquote. Just as our grandfathers in their old-fashioned wisdom used to say, anyone can bring children into the world, so today the, quote, modern socialists, a la Narcissus Tupolev, say in their wisdom, anyone can participate in the spontaneous birth of a new social order. We too hold that anyone can. All that is required for participation of that kind is to yield to economism when economism reigns, and to terrorism when terrorism arises. Thus, in the spring of this year, when it was so important to utter a note of warning against infatuation with terrorism, Rabotchi Diallo stood in amazement, confronted by a problem that was, quote, new to it. And now, 6 months after, When the problem has become less topical, it presents us at one and the same time with the declaration, quote, "We think that it is not and should not be the task of social democracy to counteract the rise of terroristic sentiments," unquote. And with the conference resolution, quote, "The conference regards systematic and aggressive terror as being inopportune." How beautifully clear and coherent this is. Not to counteract, but to declare inopportune, and to declare it in such a way that unsystematic and defensive terror does not come within the scope of the, quote, resolution. It must be admitted that such a resolution is extremely safe and is fully insured against error, just as a man who talks but says nothing insures himself against error. All that is needed to frame such a resolution is an ability to keep at the tail end of the movement. When Iskra ridiculed Rabotchi-Diallo for declaring the question of terror to be new, the latter angrily accused Iskra of, quote, "having the incredible effrontery to impose upon the party organization solutions of tactical questions proposed by a group of emigrant writers more than 15 years ago." Effrontery. Indeed, and what an overestimation of the conscious element. First, to resolve questions theoretically beforehand, and then to try to convince the organization, the party, and the masses of the correctness of this solution. How much better it would be to repeat the elements and, without imposing anything upon anybody, swing with every turn, whether in the direction of economism or in the direction of terrorism. Rabotchi-Diallo even generalizes this great precept of worldly wisdom and accuses Iskra and Zarya of, quote, "setting up their program against the movement, like a spirit hovering over the formless chaos." But what else is the function of social democracy if not a spirit that not only hovers over the spontaneous movement, but also raises this movement to the level of its program? Surely, it is not its function to drag at the tail of the movement. At best, this would be of no service to the movement. At worst, it would be exceedingly harmful. Rabotchi-Diallo, however, not only follows this tactics as process, but elevates it to a principle, so that it would be more correct to describe its tendency not as opportunism, but as tailism, from the word tail. And it must be admitted that those who are determined always to follow behind the movement and be its tail are forever and absolutely guaranteed against, quote, "belittling the spontaneous element of development." And so we have become convinced that the fundamental error committed by the, quote, "new trend" in Russian social democracy is its bowing to spontaneity and its failure to understand that the spontaneity of the masses demands a higher degree of consciousness from us social democrats. The greater the spontaneous upsurge of the masses, and the more widespread the movement, the more rapid, incomparably so, the demand for greater consciousness in the theoretical, political, and organizational work of social democracy. The spontaneous upsurge of the masses in Russia proceeded, and continues, with such rapidity that the young social democrats proved unprepared to meet these gigantic tasks. This unpreparedness is our common misfortune, the misfortune of all Russian social democrats. The upsurge of the masses proceeded and spread with uninterrupted continuity. It not only continued in the places where it began, but spread to new localities and to new strata of the population under the influence of the working class movement. There was a renewed ferment among the student youth, among the intellectuals generally, and even among the peasantry. Revolutionaries, however, lagged behind this upsurge, both in their, quote, theories and in their activity. They failed to establish a constant and continuous organization capable of leading the whole movement. In Chapter 1, we established that Rabotchi-Diallo belittled our theoretical tasks and that it, quote, spontaneously repeated the fashionable catchword, quote, freedom of criticism. Those who repeated this catchword lacked the, quote, consciousness to understand that the positions of the opportunist, quote, critics, and those of the revolutionaries in Germany and in Russia are diametrically opposed. In the following chapters, we shall show how this bowing to spontaneity found expression in the sphere of the political tasks and in the organizational work of social democracy. And that is the end of Chapter 2. Before we go on to Chapter 3, I just want to mention briefly, lots of this work so far have been in quotes. Lenin is both actually directly quoting other people who he is criticizing and mocking as well. And he's also putting a lot of things in quotes sort of sarcastically for emphasis. It's a little bit difficult to convey over an audiobook. I'm doing my best, but if you find yourself confused by this so far, the link is in the description. I would suggest you go to Marxists.org and get the PDF, because there's so many quotes. Sometimes there's sentences with like 4 or 5 different words or phrases or lines in quotes. So again, it's just a little bit difficult to convey. I'm doing what I can with tone of voice, inflection, saying quote unquote, but again, I feel it's just a little hard to convey. Okay. Chapter 3, Trade Unionist Politics and Social Democratic Politics. We shall again begin by praising Rabotchi-Diello. Literature of Exposure and the Proletarian Struggle is the title Martynov gave the article on his differences with Iskra published in Rabotchi-Diello number 10. He formulated the substance of the differences as follows, quote, "We cannot confine ourselves solely to exposing the system that stands in the working class party's path of development. We must also react to the immediate and current interests of the proletariat. Iskra is in fact an organ of revolutionary opposition that exposes the state of affairs in our country, particularly the political state of affairs. We, however, work and shall continue to work for the cause of the working class in close organic contact with the proletarian struggle," unquote. One cannot help being grateful to Martynov for this formula. It is of outstanding general interest because substantially it embraces not only our disagreements with Rabotchi-Diello, but the general disagreement between ourselves and the economists on the political struggle. We have shown that the economists do not altogether repudiate politics, but that they are constantly straying from the social democratic to the trade unionist conception of politics. Martynov strays in precisely this way, and we shall therefore take his views as a model of economist error on this question. As we shall endeavor to prove, neither the authors of the separate supplement to Rabotchi Missal, nor the authors of the manifesto issued by the Self-Emancipation Group, nor the authors of the Economist letter published in Iskra number 12 will have any right to complain against this choice. Section 3.1. Political agitation and its restriction by the economists. Everyone knows that the economic struggle of the Russian workers underwent widespread development and consolidation simultaneously with the production of, quote, literature exposing economic, factory, and occupational conditions. The, quote, leaflets were devoted mainly to the exposure of the factory system, and very soon a veritable passion for exposures was roused among the workers. As soon as the workers realized that the social democratic study circles desired to, and could, supply them with a new kind of leaflet that told the whole truth about their miserable existence, about their unbearably hard toil, and their lack of rights, they began to send in, actually flood us with correspondence from the factories and workshops. This, quote, exposure literature created a tremendous sensation, not only in the particular factory exposed in the given leaflet, but in all the factories to which news of the revealed facts spread. And since the poverty and want among the workers in the various enterprises and in the various trades are much the same, the, quote, truth about the life of the workers stirred everyone. Even among the most backward workers, a veritable passion arose to, quote, get into print. A noble passion for this rudimentary form of war against the whole of the present social system, which is based upon robbery and oppression. And in the overwhelming majority of cases, these, quote, leaflets were in truth a declaration of war, because the exposures served greatly to agitate the workers. They evoked among them common demands for the removal of the most glaring outrages, and roused in them a readiness to support the demands with strikes. Finally, the employers themselves were compelled to recognize the significance of these leaflets as a declaration of war, so much so that in a large number of cases they did not even wait for the outbreak of hostilities. As is always the case, the mere publication of these exposures made them effective, and they acquired the significance of a strong moral influence," On more than one occasion, the mere appearance of a leaflet proved sufficient to secure the satisfaction of all or part of the demands put forward. In a word, economic or factory exposures were and remain an important lever in the economic struggle, and they will continue to retain this significance as long as there is capitalism, which makes it necessary for the workers to defend themselves. Even in the most advanced countries of Europe, it can still be seen that the exposure of abuses in some backward trade or in some forgotten branch of domestic industry serves as a starting point for the awakening of class consciousness, for the beginning of a trade union struggle, and for the spread of socialism. The overwhelming majority of Russian social democrats have of late been almost entirely absorbed by this work of organizing the exposure of factory conditions. Suffice it to recall Robochia Missile to see the extent to which they have been absorbed by it. So much so, indeed, that they have lost sight of the fact that this, taken by itself, is in essence still not social democratic work, but merely trade union work. As a matter of fact, the exposures merely dealt with the relations between the workers in a given trade and their employers, and all they achieved was that the sellers of labor power learned to sell their, quote, commodity on better terms, and to fight the purchasers over a purely commercial deal. These exposures could have served, if properly utilized by an organization of revolutionaries, as a beginning and a component part of social democratic activity, but they could also have led, and given a worshipful attitude towards spontaneity, were bound to lead, to a, quote, purely trade union struggle, and to a non-social democratic working class movement. Social democracy leads the struggle of the working class not only for better terms for the sale of labor power, but for the abolition of the social system that compels the propertyless to sell themselves to the rich. Social democracy represents the working class, not in its relation to a given group of employers alone, but in its relation to all classes of modern society and to the state as an organized political force. Hence, it follows that not only must social democrats not confine themselves exclusively to the economic struggle, but that they must not allow the organization of economic exposures to become the predominant part of their activities. We must take up actively the political education of the working class and the development of its political consciousness. Now that Zarya and Iskra have made the first attack upon economism, quote, all are agreed on this, although some agree only in words, as we shall soon see. The question arises, what should political education consist in? Can it be confined to the propaganda of working class hostility to the autocracy? Of course not. It is not enough to explain to the workers that they are politically oppressed, any more than it is to explain to them that their interests are antagonistic to the interest of the employers. Agitation must be conducted with regard to every concrete example of this oppression, as we have begun to carry on agitation round concrete examples of economic oppression. Inasmuch as this oppression affects the most diverse classes of society, inasmuch as it manifests itself in the most varied spheres of life and activity, vocational, civic, personal, family, religious, scientific, etc., is it not evident that we shall not be fulfilling our task of developing the political consciousness of the workers if we do not undertake the organization of the political exposure of the autocracy in all its aspects? In order to carry on agitation round concrete instances of oppression, these instances must be exposed, as it is necessary to expose factory abuses in order to carry on economic agitation. One might think this to be clear enough. It turns out, however, that it is only in words that, quote, all are agreed on the need to develop political consciousness in all its aspects. It turns out that Robochia Diello, for example, far from tackling the task of organizing, or making a start in organizing, comprehensive political exposure, is even trying to drag Iskra, which has undertaken this task, away from it. Listen to the following, quote, the political struggle of the working class is merely, it certainly is not merely, the most developed, wide, and effective form of economic struggle, unquote. Quote, the Social Democrats are now confronted with the task of lending the economic struggle itself, as far as possible, a political character. Quote, the economic struggle is the most widely applicable means of drawing the masses into active political struggle. As the reader will observe, all these theses permeate Raboccia Diello from its very first number to the latest instructions to the editors, and all of them evidently express a single view regarding political agitation and struggle. Let us examine this view from the standpoint of the opinion prevailing among all economists, that political agitation must follow economic agitation. Is it true that, in general, the economic struggle, quote, is the most widely applicable means, unquote, of drawing the masses into the political struggle? It is entirely untrue. Any and every manifestation of police tyranny and autocratic outrage, not only in connection with the economic struggle, is not one whit less, quote, widely applicable as a means of, quote, drawing in the masses. The rural superintendents and the flogging of peasants, the corruption of officials and the police treatment of the, quote, common people in the cities, the fight against the famine-stricken and the suppression of the popular striving towards enlightenment and knowledge, the extortion of taxes and the persecution of the religious sects, the humiliating treatment of soldiers and the barrack methods in the treatment of the students and liberal intellectuals. Do all these and 1,000 other similar manifestations of tyranny, though not directly connected with the, quote, economic struggle, represent, in general, less, quote, widely applicable means and occasions for political agitation and for drawing the masses into the political struggle? The very opposite is true. Of the sum total of cases in which the workers suffer, either on their own account or on account of those closely connected with them, from tyranny, violence, and the lack of rights, undoubtedly only a small minority represent cases of police tyranny in the trade union struggle as such. Why then should we beforehand restrict the scope of political agitation by declaring only one of the means to be the, quote, most widely applicable, when social democrats must have, in addition, other, generally speaking, no less, quote, widely applicable means? In the dim and distant past, a full year ago, Raboccia Diello wrote, quote, the masses begin to understand immediate political demands after one strike, or at all events after several, quote, as soon as the government sets the police and gendarmerie against them. This opportunist theory of stages has now been rejected by the Union abroad, which makes a concession to us by declaring, quote, there is no need whatever to conduct political agitation right from the beginning, exclusively on an economic basis. The Union's repudiation of part of its former errors will show the future historian of Russian social democracy better than any number of lengthy arguments the depths to which our economists have degraded socialism. But the Union abroad must be very naive indeed to imagine that the abandonment of one form of restricting politics will induce us to agree to another form. Would it not be more logical to say, in this case too, that the economic struggle should be conducted on the widest possible basis, that it should always be utilized for political agitation, but that, quote, there is no need whatever to regard the economic struggle as the most widely applicable means of drawing the masses into active political struggle? The Union abroad attaches significance to the fact that it has substituted the phrase, quote, most widely applicable means for the phrase, quote, the best means, contained in one of the resolutions of the Fourth Congress of the Jewish Workers' Union. We confess that we find it difficult to say which of these resolutions is the better one. In our opinion, they are both worse. Both the Union abroad and the Bund fall into the error, partly, perhaps unconsciously, under the influence of tradition, of giving an economist, trade unionist interpretation to politics. Whether this is done by employing the word best or the words most widely applicable makes no essential difference whatsoever. Had the Union abroad said that, quote, political agitation on an economic basis is the most widely applied, not applicable, means, it would have been right in regard to a certain period in the development of our social democratic movement. It would have been right in regard to the economists, and to many, if not the majority, of the practical workers of 1898 to 1901. For these practical economists applied political agitation, to the extent that they applied it at all, almost exclusively on an economic basis. Political agitation on such lines was recognized, and as we have seen, even recommended, by Raboccia Missal and the Self-Emancipation Group. Raboccia Diello should have strongly condemned the fact that the useful work of economic agitation was accompanied by the harmful restriction of the political struggle. Instead, it declares the means most widely applied by the economists to be the most widely applicable. It is not surprising that when we call these people economists, they can do nothing but pour every manner of abuse upon us. They call us mystifiers, disruptors, papal nuncios, and slanderers, go complaining to the whole world that we have mortally offended them, and then declare almost on oath that, quote, not a single social democratic organization is now tinged with economism. Oh, those evil, slanderous politicians, they must have deliberately invented this economism out of sheer hatred of mankind in order mortally to offend other people. What concrete, real meaning attaches to Martinov's words when he sets before social democracy the task of, quote, lending the economic struggle itself a political character? The economic struggle is the collective struggle of the workers against their employers for better terms in the sale of their labor power, for better living and working conditions. This struggle is necessarily a trade union struggle because working conditions differ greatly in different trades, and consequently, the struggle to improve them can only be conducted on the basis of trade organizations. In the Western countries, through trade unions; in Russia, through temporary trade associations and through leaflets, etc. Lending, quote, the economic struggle itself a political character means, therefore, striving to secure satisfaction of these trade demands, the improvement of working conditions in each separate trade by means of, quote, legislative and administrative measures, as Martinov puts it on the ensuing page of his article. This is precisely what all workers' trade unions do and always have done. Read the works of the soundly scientific and, quote, soundly opportunist Mr. and Mrs. Webb, and you will see that the British trade unions long ago recognized and long have been carrying out the task of, quote, lending the economic struggle itself a political character. They have long been fighting for the right to strike, for the removal of all legal hindrances to the cooperative and trade union movements, for laws to protect women and children, for the improvement of labor conditions by means of health and factory legislation, etc. Thus, the pompous phrase about, quote, lending the economic struggle itself a political character, which sounds so, quote, terrifically profound and revolutionary, serves as a screen to conceal what is in fact the traditional striving to degrade social democratic politics to the level of trade union politics, under the guise of rectifying the one-sidedness of Iskra, which, it is alleged, places, quote, the revolutionizing of dogma higher than the revolutionizing of life. We are presented with the struggle for economic reforms as if it were something entirely new. In point of fact, the phrase, quote, lending the economic struggle itself a political character, means nothing more than the struggle for economic reforms. Martinov himself might have come to this simple conclusion had he pondered over the significance of his own words. Our party, he says, training his heaviest guns on Iskra, could and should have presented economic demands to the government for legislative and administrative measures against economic exploitation, unemployment, famine, etc. Concrete demands for measures. Does this not mean demands for social reforms? Again, we ask the impartial reader, are we slandering the Rabotchia Dieloites? May I be forgiven for this awkward, currently used designation, by calling them concealed Bernsteinians when, as their point of disagreement with Iskra, they advanced their thesis on the necessity of struggling for economic reforms. Revolutionary social democracy has always included the struggle for reforms as part of its activities, but it utilizes, quote, economic agitation for the purpose of presenting to the government not only demands for all sorts of measures, but also, and primarily, the demand that it cease to be an autocratic government. Moreover, it considers it its duty to present this demand to the government on the basis not of the economic struggle alone, but of all manifestations in general of public and political life. In a word, it subordinates the struggle for reforms as the part to the whole to the revolutionary struggle for freedom and for socialism. Martinov, however, resuscitates the theory of stages in a new form and strives to prescribe, as it were, an exclusively economic path of development for the political struggle. By advancing at this moment, when the revolutionary movement is on the upgrade, an alleged special task of struggling for reforms, he is dragging the party backwards and is playing into the hands of both economists and liberal opportunism. To proceed, shamefacedly hiding the struggle for reforms behind the pompous thesis of lending the economic struggle itself a political character, Martynov advanced, as if it were a special point, exclusively economic, indeed exclusively factory, reforms. As to his reason for doing that, we do not know it. Carelessness, perhaps? Yet if he had in mind something else besides factory reforms, then the whole of his thesis, which we have cited, loses all sense. Perhaps he did it because he considers it possible and probable that the government will make concessions only in the economic sphere. If so, then it is a strange delusion. Concessions are also possible and made in the sphere of legislation concerning flogging, passports, land redemption payments, religious sects, the censorship, etc., etc. Economic concessions, or pseudo-concessions, are of course the cheapest and most advantageous from the government's point of view, because by these means it hopes to win the confidence of the working masses. For this very reason, we Social Democrats must not, under any circumstances or in any way whatsoever, create grounds for the belief, or the misunderstanding, that we attach greater value to economic reforms, or that we regard them as being particularly important, etc. Such demands, writes Martynov, speaking of the concrete demands for legislative and administrative measures referred to above, would not merely be a hollow sound, because, promising certain palpable results, they might be actively supported by the working masses. We are not economists, oh no, we only cringe as slavishly before the, quote, palpableness of concrete results, as do the Bernsteins, the Prokopoviches, the Struds, the RMs and tutti quanti. We only wish to make it understood, together with Narcissus Tupolev, that all which, quote, does not promise palpable results is merely a, quote, hollow sound. We are only trying to argue as if the working masses were incapable and had not already proved their capabilities, notwithstanding those who ascribe their own Philistinism to them, of actively supporting every protest against the autocracy, even if it promises absolutely no palpable results whatsoever. Let us take, for example, the very measures for the relief of unemployment and the famine that Martynov himself advances. Robochye Dielo is engaged, judging by what it has promised, in drawing up and elaborating a program of, quote, concrete, in the form of bills, demands for legislative and administrative measures, quote, promising palpable results. While Iskra, which, quote, constantly places the revolutionizing of dogma higher than the revolutionizing of life, has tried to explain the inseparable connection between unemployment and the whole capitalist system, has given warning that, quote, famine is coming, has exposed the police, quote, fight against the famine-stricken, and the outrageous, quote, provisional penal servitude regulations. And Zarya has published a special reprint in the form of an agitational pamphlet of a section of its review of home affairs dealing with the famine. But good God, how, quote, one-sided were these incorrigibly narrow and orthodox doctrinaires, how deaf to the calls of, quote, life itself. Their articles contained, oh horror, not a single, can you imagine it, not a single, quote, concrete demand, quote, promising palpable results. Poor doctrinaires, they ought to be sent to Khrushchevsky and Martynov to be taught that tactics are a process of growth, of that which grows, etc., and that the economic struggle itself should be given a political character. Quote, in addition to its immediate revolutionary significance, the economic struggle of the workers against the employers and the government, economic struggle against the government, has also this significance. It constantly brings home to the workers the fact that they have no political rights. We quote this passage from Martynov not in order to repeat for the 100th and 1,000th time what...
Same time tomorrow. Light workout, just exercises with techniques.